You know what scares people more than death? A man who doesn't need them. And I'm not talking about some antisocial weirdo living in his mom's basement. I'm talking about that guy who walks into a room and doesn't immediately scan for approval, doesn't check his phone every 30 seconds, doesn't laugh at jokes that aren't funny just to fit in. Here's what I mean. Last week, I'm at this networking event. You know the type. Bunch of guys in ill-fitting suits pretending they're crushing it. Everyone's working the room like their life depends on it. Handshakes, business cards, forced small talk about quarterly projections. And there's this one dude, maybe 45, standing by himself near the bar, not scrolling his phone, not desperately trying to join conversations, just there, comfortable, present. And here's the thing, people kept glancing at him, not because he was doing anything, because he wasn't doing anything. He wasn't performing, and that made everyone else's performance look desperate. So let me ask you something, and be honest with yourself here. When's the last time you were truly alone with your thoughts, without reaching for a distraction? When's the last time you sat in silence and didn't immediately feel like you needed to fill it with noise, people, or some kind of stimulation? Because if that question makes you uncomfortable, we need to talk. Here's the brutal truth nobody wants to face. Our entire society is built on your insecurity. Think on being dramatic? Walk into any mall, scroll through any social platform, watch any commercial. Every single message is the same. You're not enough. You need this product. You need this relationship. You need this experience. You need. And most people buy it, literally and figuratively. They spend their whole lives chasing external validation like junkies chasing their next hit. Social media likes, relationship status updates, career promotions that look good on LinkedIn, but feel empty inside. They're running on a hamster wheel, convinced that the next achievement, the next purchase, the next person will finally make them feel complete. But here's what they don't tell you. The game is rigged. It's designed to keep you hungry, keep you wanting, keep you dependent. Because the moment you realize you don't actually need any of that, you become dangerous. You stop buying what they're selling. You stop playing by their rules. You stop being controllable. The guy at that networking event, he'd figured this out. He wasn't there because he needed to network. He was there because he chose to be. Big difference. When you operate from choice instead of need, everything changes. Your energy changes. Your presence changes. Your power changes. See, most people think solitude is about being alone. Wrong. Solitude is about being whole. It's about reaching a point where you're not looking for other people to complete you, validate you, or save you from yourself. And that terrifies people, because it reminds them of everything they're not. Marcus Aurelius understood this 2,000 years ago. Here's a guy who literally ruled the known world, had unlimited power and resources, could have anyone do anything. Yet every night, he'd retreat to his private quarters and write in his journal. Not about conquests or politics, about how to be a better human being, how to think clearly, how to stay centered when everyone around him was losing their minds. In his meditations, which, by the way, he never intended for anyone else to read, he wrote something that should be tattooed on every man's forehead. Very little is needed to make a happy life. It is all within yourself, in your way of thinking. Think about that. The most powerful man alive saying happiness comes from within, not from external circumstances, not from other people, from your own thinking. That's dangerous knowledge right there. Fast forward to the 19th century, and you've got Friedrich Nietzsche saying something even more radical. The individual has always had to struggle not to be overwhelmed by the tribe. Nietzsche saw that most people are basically sheep, following whatever the crowd tells them to follow. They adopt beliefs they never examined, pursue goals they never chose. Live lives that aren't actually theirs. But the person who learns to be alone with their thoughts, they start asking uncomfortable questions. Why do I believe this? Who benefits from me believing this? What would I choose if I had to start from scratch? And once you start thinking for yourself, you can't go back. You become unpredictable, uncontrollable, dangerous. Both of these guys understood something that modern society desperately wants to keep hidden. The person who doesn't need external validation is the person who can't be manipulated. And that makes you the most dangerous person in any room. Let me give you 3 truths that most people can't handle. First truth: most relationships are just mutual dependency disguised as love. Look around at the couples you know. How many of them are actually together because they enjoy each other's company versus being together because they're terrified of being alone? How many stay in relationships that stopped working years ago because the alternative, solitude, feels worse than the dysfunction they know? I'm not saying all relationships are fake. I'm saying most people enter relationships from a place of neediness rather than strength. They're looking for someone to complete them instead of someone to complement them. And when you build a relationship on dependency, you're not building on solid ground. You're building on quicksand. The dangerous truth is that until you're comfortable being alone, you'll never know if you're with someone because you want to be or because you're afraid not to be. And that distinction makes all the difference between a relationship and a crutch. Second truth: your social anxiety isn't a disorder, it's intelligence. Society tells you that if you're uncomfortable in social situations, something's wrong with you. You need therapy, medication, or coaching to become more social. But what if your discomfort is actually your brain correctly identifying that most social interactions are performative bullshit? What if your anxiety around small talk isn't a bug, it's a feature? What if your reluctance to engage in gossip, status games, and surface-level conversations is actually a sign that you're operating on a different frequency than most people? I'm not saying all social anxiety is good, but I am saying that a lot of what gets labeled as social anxiety is actually intellectual honesty. You're not comfortable pretending to care about things you don't care about. You're not good at faking enthusiasm for conversations that feel meaningless. And instead of celebrating that authenticity, society tells you to fix it. Third truth: the loneliness epidemic isn't about being alone. It's about being surrounded by people who don't understand you. We keep hearing about how lonely people are, especially men. But here's what nobody talks about. Most of that loneliness comes from being in rooms full of people and feeling completely disconnected from them. You can be married, have 100 friends on social media, go to parties every weekend, and still feel profoundly alone. Because loneliness isn't about physical proximity. It's about meaningful connection. And meaningful connection requires depth, authenticity, and the willingness to be vulnerable in ways that most people simply can't handle. The guy who chooses solitude over shallow social interactions isn't avoiding connection. He's refusing to settle for fake connection. He'd rather be genuinely alone than fake connected. And that choice, that standard, that refusal to compromise, that's what makes him dangerous. Let me paint you a picture of what happens when you don't develop this capacity for solitude. When you stay dependent on external validation and social approval for your sense of self-worth. First, you become a slave to other people's opinions. Every decision you make gets filtered through, what will people think? Instead of, what do I actually want? You choose careers that look impressive rather than feel meaningful. You stay in relationships that drain you because ending them would require explaining yourself to others. You buy things you don't need to impress people you don't even like. Your entire life becomes a performance for an audience that doesn't really care about you anyway. Second, you lose touch with who you actually are underneath all the social conditioning. When you're constantly adapting yourself to fit in, constantly modifying your opinions to avoid conflict, constantly performing for approval, you forget what your authentic thoughts and feelings even are. You become like one of those people who's asked what kind of food they like and responds with, "I don't know, what do you like?" Not because they're being polite, but because they genuinely don't know their own preferences anymore. Third, you become incredibly easy to manipulate. Politicians know this. Marketers know this. Toxic people in your personal life know this. When someone's primary need is social acceptance, you can control them by threatening to withdraw that acceptance. You can make them do almost anything by making them afraid of being rejected, excluded, or judged. I've watched grown men completely compromise their values, their integrity, their self-respect, all because they were terrified of being seen as difficult, antisocial, or weird. They'd rather be liked than be right. They'd rather be accepted than be authentic. And that's not strength. That's cowardice disguised as social skills. But here's the really brutal part. It doesn't even work. The approval you're chasing, it's not real. People don't actually respect the guy who always agrees with them. They don't admire the guy who never has his own opinion. They don't trust the guy who changes his personality depending on who's in the room. Deep down, they sense the desperation, the neediness, the lack of inner foundation, and it repels them. So you end up getting the opposite of what you wanted. Instead of genuine acceptance, you get polite tolerance. Instead of real friendship, you get surface-level interactions. Instead of respect, you get that subtle dismissiveness that people reserve for those they perceive as weak. You trade your authenticity for approval, and you don't even get the approval. All right, enough diagnosis. Let's talk about the cure. How do you develop this dangerous capacity for solitude? How do you become the kind of person who doesn't need external validation to feel complete? Start with silence. Most people are addicted to noise. Podcasts, music, TV, social media. Anything to avoid being alone with their thoughts. But you can't develop inner strength if you never spend time going inward. Start small. 15 minutes a day with no inputs. No phone, no music, no distractions. Just sit with yourself. At first, it'll be uncomfortable, where mind will race. You'll want to reach for your phone. Do it anyway. This is mental training, like going to the gym, but for your psychological muscles. The goal isn't to achieve some Zen state. The goal is to become comfortable with your own mental landscape, to stop being afraid of your own thoughts, to realize that you're not going to die if you spend time alone in your head. Most people avoid this because they're afraid of what they might discover about themselves. But here's the thing. Whatever's in there is already in there. Avoiding it doesn't make it go away. It just makes it run your life from the shadows. Next, develop your own moral code. Stop borrowing your values from your parents, your culture, your peer group, or whatever's trending on social media. Spend time figuring out what you actually believe and why. What kind of person do you want to be? What principles are you willing to stand for, even when it costs you socially? What lines won't you cross, regardless of what others expect? This isn't about becoming rebellious for the sake of being rebellious. It's about becoming intentional about your choices. When you have a clear sense of your own values, other people's opinions become much less important. You're not making decisions based on what gets you approval. You're making decisions based on what aligns with who you've chosen to be. Practice saying no without explaining yourself. This is huge. Most people feel compelled to justify every boundary they set, every invitation they decline, every request they refuse. But explanations often turn into negotiations. And when you negotiate your boundaries, you've already lost. Learn to say no, I can't do that, or no, that doesn't work for me, without a 3-paragraph explanation of why. You don't owe anyone an explanation for your choices. The people who matter will respect your boundaries. The people who don't respect your boundaries don't matter. Audit your relationships. Look at the people in your life honestly. Which relationships energize you and which ones drain you? Which people accept you as you are and which ones only like you when you're performing for them? Which relationships are based on mutual respect and which ones are based on you providing something, entertainment, validation, emotional labor to someone else? This doesn't mean cutting everyone off and becoming a hermit. It means being selective about who gets access to your time and energy. Quality over quantity. A few genuine connections are worth more than dozens of superficial ones. Now, let me tell you what happens when you develop this capacity for solitude, when you become genuinely comfortable with yourself. First, your relationships improve dramatically. When you're not desperate for approval, you attract different kinds of people. You attract people who are also comfortable with themselves, who don't need you to be anything other than who you are. The relationships become more honest, more genuine, more satisfying. And the relationships that don't improve, they reveal themselves to be based on your neediness rather than genuine connection, and they naturally fade away. Good riddance. Second, your decision-making becomes clearer. When you're not constantly worried about what others will think, you can focus on what actually makes sense. You choose careers based on what you find meaningful rather than what looks impressive. You spend money on things you actually value rather than things that signal status. You make choices based on your own criteria rather than trying to optimize for social approval. Third, you develop what I call FU money, but not the financial kind, the psychological kind. You reach a point where you're willing to walk away from anything that doesn't align with your values. Toxic job? You can leave. Draining relationship? You can end it. Social situation that feels fake? You can excuse yourself. This isn't about being antisocial. It's about having options. And having options gives you power. But here's the really beautiful part. When you stop needing people, you can actually start enjoying them. When you're not constantly analyzing every interaction for signs of approval or rejection, you can be present with people. When you're not performing for validation, you can be authentic. When you're not afraid of being alone, you can choose to be with others from a place of strength rather than weakness. Have you ever noticed how the most charismatic people seem to be the ones who aren't trying to be charismatic? They're not working the room, not trying to impress anyone, not seeking attention. They're just comfortable in their own skin. And that comfort, that self-possession, that lack of neediness, it's magnetic. People are drawn to it because it's so rare. When you develop this capacity for solitude, you become one of those people. Not because you're trying to be attractive to others, but because you've become attractive to yourself. And that's the foundation of everything else. Look, I'm not telling you to become some antisocial hermit who hates people. I'm telling you to become someone who doesn't need people, so you can actually enjoy them when you choose to be around them. The world is full of guys who are desperate for validation, who will compromise their values for acceptance, who will say whatever they think others want to hear. Don't be one of them. The world doesn't need more people pleasers. It needs more people who can think for themselves, who can stand alone when necessary, who can't be bought or manipulated or controlled. Develop that dangerous capacity for solitude. Learn to enjoy your own company. Get comfortable with silence. Stop seeking approval from people whose opinions shouldn't matter to you anyway. Build your life on a foundation of self-respect rather than social validation. Because here's the final truth. In a world where everyone is desperately trying to fit in, the most radical thing you can do is learn to stand alone. Not because you hate others, but because you don't need them to complete you. And that makes you dangerous in all the right ways. So here's my question for you, and I want you to really think about this. Maybe even drop a comment and let me know. What's one area of your life where you've been seeking validation instead of developing self-respect? What's one relationship or situation where you've been performing instead of being authentic? What's one belief you've been carrying around that you never actually chose for yourself? Because until you can answer those questions honestly, you're not really living your own life. You're living the life that others expect you to live. And that's not strength. That's a slow-motion surrender of everything that makes you who you are. If this hit you the way it hit me when I first understood it, do me a favor. Hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications, because we're just getting started. There's a whole world of uncomfortable truths waiting for you, and most people aren't ready to hear them. But if you made it this far, you might be different. And make sure you watch the next video that pops up. It's going to challenge everything you think you know about what it means to be strong in a world that rewards weakness. Until next time, stay dangerous.